We will record this session so people who weren't able to join us today can view it later. And with that, I would like to introduce our illustrious speaker today, Mr. Steve Werblow. He is a freelancer from out west in the great state of Idaho and, Oregon.
Close enough.
Botched
We have
that.
potatoes too.
Yeah, wrong place out there. That's like the Iowa-Idaho thing people do a lot. Anyway, Steve, could you tell us a little bit about your background before you get started here? And he's going to lead us through a great chat on how we can put the romance back into our writing.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's illustrious and great. Pressure's on, I guess. But anyway, happy Valentine's Day, and thanks for coming out this morning. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Steve Werblow. Grew up in New York, actually, New York State, and have been out in Ashland, Oregon since 1995. I've got that usual mixed bag of freelance duties, so I do magazine work. I'm fortunate to be able to work for the Furrow and Homestead with John Deere as a contributor to those magazines. And I also do some public relations work, so Conservation Technology Information Center and Alliance Tire and Xylem. Most of what I do is in agriculture, or I do a little bit in water as well. So that's the kind of freelance mix that I do. I'm active in the American Agricultural Editors Association and the International Federation of Agricultural Journalists. And I encourage involvement, LPC, AAEA, IFAJ, any of these organizations can be a really great opportunity, not just to meet neat people and go to interesting places, but to do what we're talking about today, which is going to be trying to find new ways to approach what might be considered old stories. So in doing that, to keep in the theme, in essence, it's falling back in love with your story. It's putting the romance back into your writing. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And the thing about those stories, those stories that we always have to write year after year, and they can be some kind of disease or market fluctuations or kind of, yes, another story about this kind of export or that kind of market issue or transportation issues. The challenge with those is, we've written them, and when you get as much gray hair as I have, it's because you've written them a lot and for a long time. And so it's hard to get certain stories to differentiate themselves in your mind. They're kind of in a crowd in your mind, and they're also in a crowd in our industry. So not only are we writing the same old stories, but so are all of our colleagues. So what we're going to try to do today is find new ways to look at some of those stories and help those new approaches stand out from the crowd. So, this poor gal, she's just mortified. We're going to do yet another scour story, which puts her in the spotlight, and it puts us in that position where we go, gosh, I've done this story, and I'm not sure where to take it this time. So we're gonna just explore how to approach a scour story or any other kind of story that doesn't just inherently sing to you right from the start. So the first thing you can do is an update, and that's the simplest approach, and it's probably the most pedestrian and least exciting. It's also the closest to just doing the darn story again. But looking for the new insight, is there something new out there? Are there new products? Or go back to an old source and someone that you've actually already hit. I mean, instinctively, we often go out and go, I got to find somebody new for this. Well, what if we go back to someone and say, okay, in 2000, she was doing this for this particular issue, or this is how she saw the markets and what it was doing to her operation. So what's different now? And go back and reference your own work, and show that timeline. That may be just enough to push the story into something new. But basically, sometimes there's just not a lot new you can do. And, as Freud said, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. You just have to, sometimes a story is just a story or an update is just an update. But let's see where we can go next. So we're going to pretend it's the first date. We're going to try to fall back in love with that story. We're going to see the new things that we maybe have been overlooking over time. And because that familiarity just lets us go, oh gosh, another one of those. Well, no, let's go see what's new about it. Let's go see what's what someone else might see in it. So I like to do what I call walking around the story. So usually, and I'm very prone to this, you see something and you hit it. It's a nail, you hit it with a hammer, and you get your story done. And instead of just looking at the nail and just looking at that one person in the center of the story or the one product or issue at the center of the story, kind of walk around it, see who else may be looking in. There are other interested parties, and by recognizing who those other interested parties are, you might be able to find either a different source or a different angle in trying to take a look at what some other folks might be looking at or might want to know about the issue. So the first thing, the most natural connection is the producer. That usually is who's at the center of our story. But instead of saying just, here's a problem, here's a nail, let's hit it with a hammer, here's how we address it, let's go a little further. Let's say, what are the other effects of this down the line? Where's my future in this? What does this do as far as sustainability goes? If I try this approach, what does that set me up for in the future? Can I use it to pivot and help help our next generation line up against this, or use it as a way to kind of gain some momentum on something else I want to accomplish, and that may give you just enough to find that new angle, to find a new way to tell that story. Okay, farm labor. Here's a big one, right? Very current. Instinctively, when we do a farm labor story, we'll often call a farmer and say, "Hey, how's it going with labor? How hard is it?" Or we'll call an economist and say, "Hey, tell me a little bit about the numbers about farm labor, about wages, about numbers, about taxes, whatever." How about we do it a little bit differently? How about we ask this guy what it's like to be a milker, and not just what it's like to be a milker in the sense of, yeah, then I use the machinery and this is how it is, or yeah, sometimes I have to reach a little farther than I'd like to because I'm shorter than the person the machine was designed for, both of which are issues. But instead, what is it like? How did he get his job? What has engaged him in keeping his job? What kind of issues does he face in terms of maintaining his job? Or what outlook does he see? And ultimately, you loop yourself back to all of those other things. You loop yourself back to the economics, the overall statistics, et cetera. But you're starting with a person, and you're starting from just another slightly different angle. And I think that can be really exciting. And I think ultimately, we hope that our readers or listeners also think it's exciting, and maybe brings us. You almost can't lose by taking a human angle on any story. And in fact, the stories that tend to benefit the most from human angles are the ones with the most numbers, because it's easy to get lost in charts and graphs, but it's a great reminder that there are people behind it and there are people stories. And again, you work your way back into the charts and graphs, but you start in on some other angle or some other source. Researchers, here's another opportunity. We talk about products, we talk about technology, but how about talking about the people who are actually doing it? What's driving them? What excites them? What are they seeing? And I'm not saying every story has to go into big feature territory, but if we start by, here's what the researcher is doing, and here's the perspective or the angle or the approach that person is taking to try to address this issue. What's happening in terms of medicine that could affect scours or PEDs or any of the other kinds of things that we talk about. And what's fun is you can kind of make it a CSI story, or you can make it you make these hero stories, and it can be a lot of fun. The hidden figures, how do we how are they trying to solve this intractable issue, or who was behind the breakthrough that allows us to now cover this story with something new. So again, it becomes, you're pinning it to a person, and it doesn't take more than a paragraph or so to have that personal connection. It doesn't have to be the full feature on the person, but It gets us started, and then we loop back into, all right, what does this mean to us on the ranch or on the farm? Buyers and consumers. Okay, this is a perspective that we often tend to overlook throughout agriculture because we work on here's how we make our stuff. Here's what we hit with the hammer. But what is the wall's impact, or view of what's happening with the hammer? So are we doing something that really impacts our consumers in a positive way or even in a negative way? And several years ago in Oregon, the extension beef people were going around the state talking about injection sites. Stop injecting your cattle in the most valuable cuts of meat because you're leaving these scars. And it was just fascinating because they take out a piece of steak and they'd show you what it looks like to the consumer in the grocery store because somebody stabbed, that animal with the injection, which is a necessary thing to do, but it was just in a wrong spot. It had an economic impact, and by looking at it from the consumer's view, I thought that was just fascinating. From the crop side, I've always been impressed that peanut producers have a laser focus on consumers. If you talk to a peanut grower for more than about a minute and a half, you're going to hear the words Snickers bar or jar of peanut butter. And that angle, that consumer focus, really brings us around to some interesting, both interesting copy and interesting look at what the impacts of a given thing are. If we're doing something that makes a better consumer experience, if it's helping make meat better or more consistent, if it's helping produce eggs that have attributes that consumers want, why we should be looking at that, and not just from the leading all the time with the production side, but also looking at leading with the consumer impact and saying, hey, what you're doing is really working. It's really helping. Or what you're doing isn't working right now, but here's what we need to do to make that consumer experience better. Again, we loop ourselves back around to all the production stuff we know we have to put in. But in the meantime, let's start it with something a different angle. What about the opponent's point of view? I mean, we often don't talk about the people who criticize us, or if we do, it's we'll take a posture that can be sometimes critical, and that's okay. We have perspectives we need to present, but I think it can be interesting to look at what are the critics actually saying, and how does that then inform what we need to go back with? What does that tell us about what people hear, because sometimes we don't always hear what the audience hears, and it's important that we do. So what is that audience hearing, and then how does that help us frame up our article about what we need to be doing or what we need to be saying in order to address what the critics are putting out there. I will say that an image like this could be very, very eye-catching. Probably get some letters, but it also shows people are reading. But we're always looking for ways to engage our audience, and sometimes something that's a little bit antagonistic that brings us into a story that allows us to share useful information could be pretty exciting, and it can be exciting to produce. And again, that puts some of the romance back in it. What about the animal's perspective? And this can be kind of precious or kind of gimmicky, but it could be interesting. What does the sow think of gestation crates? Why, if you're trying to, especially if we're trying to go to a wider audience, a consumer audience or an audience that may be critical, instead of saying, this researcher or that researcher or this farmer says X, it'd be interesting to take a look at what the animal's perspective is on it. And if you can do it with some skill, it can be a lot of fun to produce. And it could be very instructive. That's our opportunity to say, hey, look, it's safer in there and it's more secure. And, there are issues that we can bring forward using something a little bit different. I'll give you an example of one time I did something like this. I had an opportunity to walk with Temple Grandin around one of her early projects. And what I decided to do, because the audience was both agricultural and non-agricultural, it was a really widely, broadly distributed story. So what I did was I got a wide angle lens and I shot the whole story. We walked the whole approach to the slaughterhouse up to the knockbox, and I shot from about 3.5 feet off the ground. So we took a look with a wide angle lens at a cow's eye view of what the approach was, and it allowed us to explore why the shapes were the way they were. Why did the walkway curve? Why are there boards, along the gates instead of open gates? And it helped. I thought it helped communicate something a little bit different to, especially to audiences that really wouldn't have thought about the cow's experience. And so it again can be an interesting way to take up something that could otherwise be fairly dry. There are economists' angles, and it is useful to talk to economists, and it's especially useful to talk to economists when we're talking about a story that we don't always think of in economic terms, but the decisions that we make on the farm or on the ranch can have big economic implications, not just in terms of the initial sale, but in terms of bigger economic issues like exports, like world markets, and so to have economists weigh in, it's also interesting to interview economists because if you let them talk and you listen to the questions that they ask themselves, they often come up with some really interesting angles. A good economist has a great way of picking apart an issue and looking at different kinds of variables, and we can learn a lot by listening to what the economists have to say and how they approach the stories or how they approach the topics, and we can turn that into some inspiration for, first of all, better interviews, but also better stories. Wider impact. Okay, again, what's happening overseas? What are people in Asia buying from us? What's happening in terms of the development of livestock industries overseas, either in our countries that are now our customers or countries that are competitors with us, and what does that look like on the ground? And those implications, you can work your way back up the line, because changing diets, changing preferences in customer countries can impact global markets for various cuts, various kinds of meat, different species, etc. So again, maybe take a wider lens and look farther at the story, and then drill back to whatever it is that we need to get to, whatever that point was. Again, looking again with a foreign element, and this is part of that IFAJ thinking that I've gotten into, being involved with the International Federation of Agricultural Journalists and having an opportunity to see farms in other countries. There can often be interesting angles on not only what other countries are doing as far as importing or competing with us, but what issues are they facing? So, the Europeans have dealt with gestation crate issues far in advance, years before we've had to work with some of those issues. They may be trying different things, feeling around with their markets, finding consumers' tastes that may come this way, as fads or trends or preferences that start in Europe or Asia can very easily come to America. And so, how are these guys doing? Dealing with those markets and dealing with those opportunities or the challenges, and does that give us a preview for what we may face here in a few years? Look for unusual metrics. I love this story. It ran last week in the New York Times, and this was a perfect example of taking a story. This is a story about gentrification. So, neighborhoods change, money comes in, it changes the flavor of a neighborhood, et cetera, and so forth. Okay, that's a story that the New York Times probably has to write every 6 months. But this author, and I can't read the name, but anyway, this author did a phenomenal job and said, I want to look at the dogs that are in each of these neighborhoods. And they went to the licensing board and took a look at all the different kinds of species of dogs or breeds of dogs that were being registered in all these different neighborhoods, and used that as the metric to say, wow, look, this neighborhood, we're getting more of those little purse dogs. We're getting away from big guard dogs and we're getting into little purse dogs. This is a neighborhood that really treasures loyal dogs, and that reflects the neighborhood's characteristics and the fact that that neighborhood has remained very loyal to its geography and its population, et cetera, and so forth. Just a fascinating way to approach yet another gentrification story. So, good for the times. Cover the coverage. Here's a situation where I was just fascinated by this. We're in Zambia, and the fellow that you see in the middle of the page is the Minister of Agriculture. And as a reporter and as a writer, I'm trying to focus. I've got my long lens on, and I'm trying to get just a nice headshot of Mr. Lubinda and really focus on what he's saying. And my colleague and friend Shannon Van Race from Manitoba Cooperator took an entirely different approach, and she showed the fact that this guy is in the center of the scrum. He is the story. The fact that he's talking to journalists is a big part of the story. So I just thought she did a brilliant job with that. I love what she did visually, but I also love the idea that it sparked in me the idea that sometimes the coverage, the fact that the coverage is there, is part of the story. So what you're doing on your farm or your ranch can be making the news. Many of our readers or listeners don't necessarily think, gosh, they care, Japan, about what I do on my place. Wow, the products I use, my procedures, the way that I operate are big news in a customer country, or in New York City or Minneapolis or Dallas or wherever. Boy, they really care about that. And that's not always bad news. Sometimes they care because they love the fact that they know that somebody's out there doing a good job for their animals. So the story itself doesn't always have to be, here's what you're doing for your animals and here's how you're doing it, but rather, hey, you can lead in with the fact that people in Dallas do care, and they're really interested in what you're doing. They like hearing about this, that, or the other thing. So the coverage itself can be part of the story. I did a story like this. I happened to be living in Scotland at the time, and there was a big horse meat scandal in Britain. They'd had one a few years before, and there was another one coming round. And interestingly, the issue wasn't so much that there was horse meat in the lasagna. It was that the horse meat could have been from racehorses, which means that they would be treated with different medications than would be permissible in the food supply. So the story, as far as I was concerned, dealing with an American audience wasn't, whether the lasagna tasted good or, how, good recipes for horse meat. It was, here's what the Scotch beef, the Scottish beef industry under their Scotch beef banner had spent years building up a level of trust with consumers, and they cashed in on it when the horse meat scandal erupted. And they said, hey, here are our procedures. Here's how when you see this logo, this is what it means, and it's verifiable and traceable, et cetera, and so forth. And I thought that was brilliant. I thought that was a really neat thing to be able to bring back to an American audience. So again, the coverage was the launching point for the angle of the story. So let's talk about structure. So structure, because by structuring something in a new way, we can stimulate ourselves as writers and our audiences, and hopefully create something new, a better experience. So just the facts. Again, sometimes you just got to do the story, and sometimes just reporting on it, either because of space or because everybody knows that they just need to know this particular thing. Just give it to me. Let's hear it. But we can go beyond. Okay, and I'm going to emphasize here. I write from outlines. I always write an outline because it gives me a chance to review my quotes and what I have. I really get to take inventory of what I already know about the story, what I need to know, and I like to see all those pieces in front of me. If you're going to monkey with your structure, do an outline, because it'll really help you not fall back into whatever it is that's your usual mode of writing, but rather actually execute this change in structure. When you make a change, it's nice to have something behind you or beneath you that gives you that foundation and helps you keep your direction. So I like looking big picture, small picture. For those of us old enough to have enjoyed Ferris Bueller a time or two or 100, there's a point where a character, Cameron, is in the museum in Chicago, and he's looking at a Seurat painting, and he zooms in deeply in and to the point where you can see every little individual dot, and then it zooms back out and you see the globe, and it's a fun visually, it's a really fun moment, but it's also kind of instructive because it's what we can do as journalists. Maybe we need to zoom way out. Again, look at the economists, look at the farm laborer himself, look at what's happening in customer countries, or sometimes we can zoom way in and take a very different look at the same issue, but in a new way. So, as an example, a story that I did that I really enjoyed was one for the furrow, where I said everybody knows what a cornfield looks like, and I want to talk about why pest control and fertilizer are really important at particular stages in the plant's growth. But instead of doing the usual blah, 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 sort of, standing up eye level approach, what I said was, let's go, microscopic and macroscopic, and let's look at what's happening at those exact moments in the anatomy of the plant, and even down at the cellular level. And then it allowed me to hang the story on, here's what's happening inside the plant, and here's what's happening at the interface between the little root hair cells and the soil. And then that gave me a chance to talk about fertilizer and pest control and how the plant grows and how it responds to those things. So again, just a different way to frame a story using sort of that zoom out or zoom in approach. Diaries or schedules. This is a great device, and you tend to see this with busy people. When you really want to emphasize that somebody's a real mover, you'll see it with celebrities. You'll see it with, busy entrepreneurs. Every once in a while, someone will say, oh, and then we met so at 6 o'clock, he's in his truck and he's out, checking cattle. And then at 6:20, he's on the phone because it's 9:20 in New York, and that's where his banker is. And it can be a really, really clever way, not only to pull a reader through the story in a fast, sort of easy to skim way, but it also communicates something that the form, the medium becomes the message. The form helps tell the story, and what it's telling you is this person is moving, and it can be a lot of fun to write. It also kind of writes itself in a way, because your structure, in essence, tells you exactly what you need to put in for any given point. Here's another one that does exactly the same thing, the road trip. So, you start at the beginning and you end at the end, and along the way you hang all the elements of your story. And this is another one that writes itself, because you just pick your points and you figure out what elements of the story you want to hang on to those points. In this case, I was following grain through the Columbia Snake River system about 10, 15 years ago, and really it was all about efficiency in transportation and how important the river system is as far as allowing American farmers to export their product. But the way I did it was just following that grain down. Walt Cooley years ago did a piece I really admired in Progressive Dairyman, where he followed milk to Asia, and I thought that was brilliant. Even without a big plane ticket, you can follow a carcass. So here's the packing house. Where do my best cuts go? And let's follow those, and let's see what that processing and consumer experience is, and then let's take those less expensive cuts, and where do those go, and what is that experience? What happens down there? And then let's take the organ meats and the offal. Is it going to Mexico? How important is that? What does that contribute to the value of my carcass? Those elements can be a really interesting way to approach a big story about the value of an animal, and how trade associations are trying to increase that value either by developing markets or developing products and cuts that help encourage or create greater value. I mean, you can follow a goat to an Eid al-Fitr feast, and any place you are in the country, near a big city, you can find Muslim people enjoying Eid, and they're eating goat, and so you have this opportunity to explain why are goat meat sales going so well. Well, here's one reason. How's your goat being used? Granted, goats are not a huge market, but or huge readership, but that there are going to be people who say, how is my goat being eaten? Is it being eaten in cuts? Is it being eaten in stew, or is it being roasted whole? I guess I never really thought about that. So it can be an interesting way, again, to get you into a story that may look at a larger aspect of the industry. So then looking again, another kind of structure is the Q&A structure. And I don't think we use this enough in agriculture. I think it can be a really interesting approach. Again, another one that writes itself. You have to either record it or be extremely good at note-taking, because when you're quoting somebody to such an extent, you have to be very true to how they say things. So if they say potash versus potassium versus K, that's going to be important, and you have to be very faithful to it. But it could be a really nice way to let your source's voice come through and to really establish the importance that your source plays in the role. More than one source in a Q&A. Entertainment Weekly does this really well. Foreign Policy does it. Wired does it sometimes. They'll interview a couple people at once, and you get to see the interaction between the people or among the people. And that can be really interesting, because then your story is not just highlighting the information or the source, but the relationship between or among the sources. And I think that can be really telling. I think it can be interesting. I imagine it's probably pretty fun to put together. So just something worth looking at. Or two parties interviewing each other. This is something the New York Times has started doing in its op-ed, and I really like that. Because then you have two subject experts talking. And again, you see the relationship, you kind of see where their conversation takes them. And I'll bet with some of the really brilliant people we have in agriculture, it would be great to put a couple of producers together, a couple of professors together, a producer and a processor. I think that would be just fascinating. So, the challenge is out there. The gauntlet is thrown. So hopefully somebody will do that and send me a copy, because I'd love to see how it comes out. Sometimes, so I talked a little bit about being true in your note-taking and talking about voice. So here's a project where we did an entire issue of the Furrow as a series of first-person essays. So we go out and interview the subjects, the farmers, the researchers, and then came back to them with, basically, here's what you said. Can we publish this as your article? And it was a lot of fun to do, and it was a really neat way to really zero in, not just on what the person meant, but what the person says and how they say it. And if you want to put some adventure and romance back into your writing, try something different like that. Interview with a different ear, and see if you can really carry forward an entire story based on the interview that you did. It's tougher than it sounds, and it's really a lot of fun. But again, you have to be super true to capturing the way that the person expresses him or herself. So you've got that first person approach. You have to pick up that subject style. You can also do several perspectives. Here's something, and I haven't read these, but the book series that the Game of Thrones is set on. One of the things that my friends who've read it and are deeply engaged in it really appreciate is that each that you're getting different perspectives. Each element of it is reported by a different character, and so you're getting that character's perspective. Faulkner did it too, Sound and the Fury. So this character, here's that person's perspective, here's that other person's perspective. In a story, that could be really, really interesting. And so maybe you denote one with italics and one with, regular type or something like that. But again, come around that story, look at that story in different ways, and challenge yourself as a writer to construct it in a new way. Shifting from narrator to subject, that's another well-used approach, and it could be really interesting. Again, italics for one and regular for another, or radio does this all the time, so we don't have to tell you how that's done. But radio and TV, but in print, that could be a really interesting device as well. And then let's look beyond articles. We've got audiences where we know we have shorter attention spans, and but we also know that people are pretty savvy and increasingly savvy to handling a lot of information thrown at them in kind of a jumble. And so I will say that that's a really positive thing, and that we've learned to decipher and see relationships, and infographics give us a great opportunity. So this is a USDA infographic. It's quite simple, but you immediately can start to decipher, okay, it's about Mexico. I've got some figures. I've got a trend. I've got top 5. And those are exciting things to be able to deliver. And if we've got limited space, or we want to augment that same old story, that just the facts kind of story, with something a little bit different and exciting and jazzy and challenging for us as journalists, let's look at what we can do with infographics. Let's also bring it to podcasts. How do you take, so you've got 400 words in your pub, or you've got 45 seconds in your broadcast, but there's more to it. Can we add a podcast to that? Can we really kind of go in and extend some of the discussion in podcast? Take advantage of that. Instagram feeds, there's another thing. It might be really cool visually, depict the story and let it unfold in a series of images that helps describe what it is you're trying to say. So basically, feel the love, enjoy the romance, go court your story, court your sources, really look for the love and the excitement in something that might have been perhaps just another day. You can make it exciting, and that's good for you as a professional, and it's good for your audience, because if you're feeling that love about what you're doing, your audience will pick that up and enjoy that enthusiasm as well. So there you go.
Thank you, Steve. That was so awesome. Makes me want to go write a story. Does it make anybody else want to go write? Is anybody else inspired out there? Sometimes it just feels like we're talking to ourselves.
That's true. Yeah, the idea of talking with full feedback is a little weird, I gotta say.
There's Casey. Okay. Well, do you guys have any questions? We still have a few minutes left here, and I would love to challenge Steve with one of your great questions. Do any of the students out there have questions? I think we have 16 students who are watching from the University of Illinois. I got a number count there.
Awesome.
Let's see. Look, I can go back and mess with your slides. I was gonna go look.
Look at that.
I'm gonna go check something out I wanted to point out.
Okay, so Angie says, how do you keep coming up with such great story ideas? I hope some of them are great. Thanks, Angie. A lot of it is a lot of reading and listening. What I find is when I'm taking notes with an interview with somebody, so I'm going there on one story and I'm writing, and then they say something that just strikes me as, man, that would be cool to explore. So I'll make little stars, I'll make little margin notes, I write jokes in the margins. Things that come out of people's mouths are just amazing. But then I try to make sure I go back and read those things and go, hey, I want to follow up on that thing that guy said that one time. Often I'll read, and sometimes what's really helpful is reading outside of our agricultural world and looking, again, I think that ties me in a little bit more to consumer tastes or to bigger economic trends. And then invariably, because I'm just kind of obsessive. I kind of go, hey, that kind of reminds me of what some farmers that I've met could do or deal with. So a lot of it is again just walking around the stories and reading other things, getting input in other directions, and then trying to figure out new ways and interesting ways to depict it. Okay, so I've got Heather Ann Cupsmiller says, what was one of your favorite story ideas? I think the one I showed you about with the microscopy, that one I think was truly one of my favorites, and it was really hard to get the editor on board, and finally he said, Steve, you're so excited about this. He says, I'm not sure I understand what you want to do, but if you're that excited, go do it, because I'm sure it'll come out. And that was fun. It was really fun to shoot. It was fun to do. It's on my website, so stevewerblow.com. I think there's a section and that story shows up, but that was a lot of fun. So yeah, the two parties interviewing, I like seeing that a lot. This is a note from Jennifer, that I enjoy those a lot. What kind of timeline, says Casey Brown, do you leave yourself to accomplish some of these bigger picture stories? Sometimes the story itself, sometimes the wideness of the lens isn't the issue, because they research just as fast as a simpler story or a simpler structure. So I don't know that there's much of a difference in terms of the deadlines or the timelines. It's really just trying to conceive of, because if you've got to talk to 4 people for a story, it really doesn't matter if they're 4 people that are sort of tightly compacted around the issue, or if they're 4 people that are sort of widely arrayed around it. You still got the 4 calls or the 4 visits or whatever, generally calls anymore. So yeah, I don't know if the timeline's the limit. It's more the imagination at that point. Yeah. So, and thank you, Diane. Any other questions? I heard the big bells telling me I need to shut up.
I know. Well, we really do appreciate it, Steve. I see some more people are commenting. I think that might be it for questions. If they pop up, you're welcome to stay on for a little bit and answer those if you'd like to. But we try to be done at 10:45 to allow people to get on to their next meeting. But thank you so much, Steve. I know you're busy. I know it was challenging for us to even find the time to lock you into this chat, but I really appreciate all the energy you've put into this. This is going to be a great presentation for people to come back to get ideas. They are super valuable, and I'm excited for the next story.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'll hang out a little bit if anybody does come up with any more questions.
And happy Valentine's Day.
Have a wonderful Valentine's Day and a great Wednesday.
All right. Thank you.